There is a pattern running through the last 2.5 centuries, like a crack in the foundation of modern civilization. It has ripped apart at least 3 powerful regimes, and in 2025, the United States is walking along that same fracture line, step for step, grievance for grievance, as if history handed us a script written in fear, rage, and spilled blood. In 1789, France looked like the pinnacle of Europe, rich, refined, a magnet for artists and philosophers. Within 5 years, that glittering kingdom had cut off its king's head and descended into a mechanized nightmare called the Terror, where tens of thousands were executed for political sins. In 1917, Russia was a sprawling empire, 180 million people under the Romanov crown, fresh from the carnage of World War I. In 8 months, the Tsarist regime disintegrated, the royal family was shot in a basement, and the Bolsheviks began a revolution that would claim millions of lives in civil war and purges. In 1959, Cuba was a busy Caribbean playground full of American tourists, casinos, and a middle-income economy. Within 2 years, Fidel Castro had toppled the government, seized private property, and installed a communist dictatorship that would outlive him by decades. 3 revolutions, 3 different continents, 3 very different cultures. In each case, those in power believed they were safe. They believed the masses would grumble but never rise. They believed the system was too old, too rooted, too strong to fall. In each case, they were wrong. Right now, the warning lights that flashed before those 3 revolutions are flashing again, this time over the United States. Soaring inequality, open, shameless corruption, collapsing trust in institutions, a population that feels cheated, mocked, and ignored. We are not gently drifting toward the pattern, we are already inside it. By the logic of this 6-stage cycle, America is sitting in stage 4. And history's brutal message is that stage 5 and stage 6 don't take their time. They come like a storm front, faster than anyone expects, and by the time the elites realize what's happening, they're already losing control. Before we walk through the stages, we need to be precise about the word revolution. We throw it around for everything: a big protest, a riot downtown, a new political party. But a true revolution is something far more violent and final. It is not a policy shift. It is not a change of administration. A revolution is when the existing order itself is broken and replaced, top to bottom, by something qualitatively different, and that something is very often worse. Revolutions don't erupt just because people are poor. Humanity has lived with hunger and hardship for thousands of years without overthrowing every ruler in sight. What triggers revolution is the collision between expectations and reality. When people are told again and again that they deserve prosperity, dignity, and upward mobility, and then discover that those promises were a lie, rage replaces patience. When the gap between those at the top and everyone else becomes grotesque and visible, the social contract begins to tear. And when people stop believing that the system can repair itself, that courts, elections, and parliaments are meaningful, then, as John F. Kennedy warned, when peaceful change is blocked, violent revolution stops being a fantasy and becomes an inevitability. France, Russia, Cuba, different centuries, different ideologies, but the same 6-stage chain reaction. To see how it works, we start with the prototype of the modern age, France in 1789. In the 1780s, if you had toured Europe, France would have looked invincible. Paris was the cultural capital of the world. French was the language of diplomacy and high society. Enlightenment thinkers filled salons with debates about reason and rights. On the surface, it felt like the future. On the throne sat Louis XVI, the latest in an 800-year line of kings. The monarchy seemed almost geological, as permanent as mountains. Yet behind the facade, the structure was rotten. Stage 1 in every revolution is extreme wealth inequality, and France had it in textbook form. The kingdom's 27 million people were split into 3 estates. The first estate, the clergy, maybe 130,000 people, owned around a tenth of the land and were exempt from most taxes. The second estate, the nobility, roughly 400,000 people, controlled around a quarter of the land and paid almost nothing to the state. Everyone else, roughly 26 million peasants, artisans, and a growing middle class, formed the third estate. They held the remaining land and carried almost the entire tax burden. In other words, about 1.5% of the population skated free, while nearly everyone else shouldered the costs of the kingdom. Inequality wasn't just statistical, it was visible in every village and street. Nobles hunted across peasant fields for sport. Feudal dues still demanded forced labor. The elite attended glittering balls at Versailles, while peasants measured their lives in bread. Then nature added pressure. In 1788, a disastrous harvest sent grain prices soaring. For the average peasant, bread was nearly all of the family budget. When the price doubled, there was nothing left to cut. People quite literally could not eat. Meanwhile, the court at Versailles continued its rituals, banquets, and fashion shows. The disconnect between the lives of the ruling class and the suffering of the majority became unbearable. Inequality had become not just unfair, but insulting, and that's when it becomes combustible. Stage 2 is government corruption and incompetence. Louis XVI wasn't a cartoon villain. He was pious, awkward, and utterly unsuited to crisis. France was drowning in debt, in part because it had funded the American Revolution to weaken Britain, and in part because of years of war and lavish spending. The treasury was effectively bankrupt. Louis's answer was to borrow more and raise taxes on the people least able to pay them, while the nobility and the church fought tooth and nail against any attempt to claw back their privileges. Reforms were proposed, blocked, watered down, then abandoned. Powerful factions would rather see the state stagger toward collapse than surrender their exemptions. When those with the most influence treat the state as a private cash machine instead of a public trust, the system begins to wobble. By 1789, the wobble had become a crisis. The government couldn't pay its bills. The people couldn't buy bread. In desperation, Louis summoned the Estates General, a national assembly that hadn't met in 175 years. He imagined it as a rubber stamp for new taxes. Instead, he handed a microphone to a furious, educated Third Estate. This is Stage 3, the destruction and radicalization of the middle class. Lawyers, merchants, and professionals, people who should have been pillars of stability, arrived in Versailles with notebooks full of grievances. They wanted more than minor reforms. They wanted representation. When they demanded voting by head count instead of by estate, which would have broken the nobles' automatic 2-to-1 advantage, the king and the privileged orders refused. So the Third Estate walked out. On June 17, 1789, they declared themselves the National Assembly, claiming to speak for the nation itself. When they found the meeting hall locked, they gathered in a nearby indoor tennis court and swore an oath not to disband until France had a constitution. That simple, stubborn act was revolutionary. When the educated middle class, the people in suits and spectacles, announce that the existing government has lost its legitimacy, revolution moves from possibility to probability. The pressure spilled from parchment into streets. On July 14th, Parisians stormed the Bastille, a medieval fortress prison seen as a symbol of royal tyranny. They killed the governor, freed the handful of prisoners, and marched through the city with severed heads on pikes. The image shocked Europe. Inside France, it signaled that fear had changed sides. From there, institutions began to crumble. That is stage 4, the loss of faith in the pillars of the old order. The monarchy, the church, the courts, even the symbols of nobility became targets. The National Assembly abolished feudal dues, seized church lands, and issued the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, echoing and sharpening the language of the American Revolution. For a moment, it looked like the story might end there, with a constitutional monarchy and a modern Charter of Rights. But revolutions don't freeze at moderation. The economy was still in shambles. Food was still scarce. Foreign powers threatened invasion. Fear and hunger created an opening for those who preached purity and vengeance. Stage 5 arrived, a revolutionary movement gaining mass support. The Jacobins, a radical political club led by figures like Maximilien Robespierre, argued that half measures were betrayal. They wanted the king judged and executed, enemies purged, and society remade from the ground up. On the streets of Paris, where people were tired of broken promises and queues for bread, that message resonated. In January 1793, Louis XVI was publicly guillotined. His wife, Marie Antoinette, followed later that year. The execution of the king was more than a punishment. A monarchy that had seemed eternal was gone in a single blade stroke, and the revolution devoured the last restraints on its own fury. Then came stage 6, the overthrow of the old order and the chaos that follows. Under the Committee of Public Safety, Robespierre and his allies launched the Terror. Around 40,000 people were executed in a little over a year. Nobles, priests, political rivals, and eventually moderates who had supported the revolution but not its bloodlust. Charges were vague, trials were perfunctory. An accusation could be enough to lose your head. The guillotine became daily theater, a grim kind of public programming in the squares of Paris. And, as always, the revolution eventually turned inward. Robespierre himself was arrested and guillotined, proof of a rule history repeats over and over: revolutions eat their own children. By 1799, after a decade of turmoil, economic collapse, and war, the exhausted country was ready to trade ideals for order. A young general named Napoleon Bonaparte staged a coup, ending the fragile republic and crowning himself first consul, then emperor. The uprising that began in the language of liberty, equality, and fraternity ended in a military dictatorship that plunged Europe into 15 years of war. That is the French version of the 6-stage cycle: inequality, corruption, middle-class revolt, institutional breakdown, radical seizure of power, and chaotic aftermath. Different flags, different slogans, but as we move through Russia and Cuba, you'll see the same skeleton underneath. If France was the first modern warning, Russia was the proof that even an ancient empire can fall almost overnight, once the pattern matures. By 1917, the Romanov dynasty had ruled Russia for 3 centuries. The map showed a colossal state stretching from Poland to the Pacific, 180 million people under a single crown. On paper, it looked imposing. In reality, it was brittle. Stage 1, extreme inequality, was everywhere. The Tsar and the noble class owned vast estates, palaces, and the machinery of the state. Peasants, who made up roughly 4 out of 5 Russians, technically had been freed from serfdom a generation earlier, but the freedom was mostly legal fiction. They still worked land owned by nobles or the state, often drowning in debt for the plots they were allowed to farm. In the rapidly growing cities, factory workers lived in cramped barracks, working 12 or 14 hours a day in conditions that would have shocked even some Western industrialists. Child labor was normal. Safety rules were almost non-existent. It was a feudal society forced inside an industrial shell. Stage 2 was the same lethal mix of corruption and incompetence. Nicholas II believed he ruled by divine right. That belief, combined with his timidity, made reform almost impossible. When workers marched peacefully to the Winter Palace in 1905 to ask for better conditions and representation, they were greeted not by dialogue but by rifle fire. The massacre, remembered as Bloody Sunday, shattered whatever trust remained between throne and people. It was an early tremor, a preview of what was coming. Rather than fixing the system, the regime doubled down on repression. Then World War I hit. Russia entered the conflict in 1914, and the war exposed every weakness at once. Soldiers were sent to the front without proper boots, without rifles, sometimes without ammunition. Logistics collapsed. Officers were promoted through aristocratic connections rather than competence. Millions were killed or maimed. Railways clogged. Food stopped moving. On the home front, inflation soared and bread lines lengthened. By early 1917, Russia was exhausted. The army was bleeding out. The economy was seizing up. And inside the royal court, Nicholas still clung to routine and to the counsel of Rasputin, a self-styled holy man who wielded enormous influence through the Tsarina. It was a portrait of Stage 2 government failure written in real time. The next step was almost guaranteed. In February, women in Petrograd joined protests over bread shortages. Workers walked off the job to support them. The regime sent soldiers to restore order, but many of those troops had spent years at the front. They were hungry, angry, and tired of being ordered to fire on people just like them. Instead of shooting, they joined the crowds. That was Stage 3, the turning of the middle and the armed forces against the system. Once the army refuses to defend the regime, the clock is almost done. Under pressure from the streets and from leaders in the Duma, Russia's parliament, Nicholas II abdicated in March. 300 years of Romanov rule ended not with a last stand, but with a signature. A provisional government took over, promising reform, elections, and a constitution. But in the middle of a world war, good intentions weren't enough. They made a fatal decision: to keep Russia in the war, to keep sending men to die for a cause that no one at home believed in anymore. Soldiers wanted to go back to their villages. Workers wanted bread. The provisional government delivered neither. Within months, it was seen as weak, compromised, and unable to solve anything. That was Russia's Stage 4, a collapse of faith in institutions, this time not just in the old monarchy, but in the new republic that claimed to replace it. Into that vacuum walked a man with a clear, brutal message. Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks offered 3 words: peace, land, bread. End the war. Take estates from nobles and give them to peasants. Feed the cities. It was simple, and in desperate times, simple wins. The Bolsheviks weren't the biggest party, but they were the most disciplined. They built networks in factories and barracks. They organized Soviets, workers' councils that could be turned into power structures overnight. This was Stage 5, an organized revolutionary movement gaining mass support by promising to punish the corrupt and fix what the mainstream could not. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks made their move. They seized key points in Petrograd, stormed the Winter Palace, arrested the provisional government, and declared Soviet power. The coup was surprisingly bloodless. The real blood would come afterward. Stage 6 is the overthrow of the old system and the chaos that pours through the breach. For Russia, that took the form of a brutal civil war from 1918 to 1922. The Reds, the Bolsheviks, fought the Whites, a loose coalition of monarchists, liberals, regional warlords, and foreign intervention forces. The conflict tore the country apart. Rail lines were destroyed. Crops rotted in fields. Cities shrank as people fled starvation. The Bolshevik secret police, the Cheka, waged a campaign of terror against anyone suspected of disloyalty. Executions became routine. Entire villages were punished for supporting the wrong side. In July 1918, the deposed Tsar, his wife, and their children were murdered in a basement, their bodies dumped and hidden, one more symbol of how far the old world had fallen. By the time the Reds emerged victorious, perhaps 10 million had died from battle, famine, and disease. The People's Revolution that had promised liberation installed a one-party state that would, under Stalin, kill millions more through purges and engineered famines. The pattern repeated itself: unsustainable inequality, incompetent rule, a radicalized middle, shattered institutions, a disciplined revolutionary vanguard, and finally, a new tyranny worse than the one it replaced. If Russia was a frozen empire imploding under the weight of war, Cuba in the 1950s was a sunlit warning that prosperity on the surface doesn't break the pattern underneath. Mid-century Havana glittered. Tourists from the United States filled casinos and nightclubs. American corporations invested in sugar, utilities, and infrastructure. By regional standards, Cuba's GDP per capita and literacy rates were relatively high. Yet once again, Stage 1, concentrated wealth, dominated the structure. Much of the money flowed through Havana elites and foreign companies. Rural Cuba, especially in the east, remained poor and neglected. Land was dominated by sugar estates, many foreign-owned. Seasonal work, low wages, and little access to education or healthcare created a simmering anger far from the neon lights of the capital. Stage 2 was embodied in Fulgencio Batista, the strongman who seized power in a 1952 coup and canceled elections. Under his rule, corruption wasn't just tolerated, it was the operating system. Police and judges could be bought. The regime was deeply entangled with American organized crime, which turned Havana into a casino empire and money laundering hub. Opposition figures were harassed, jailed, or disappeared. For many young Cubans, especially students and professionals, it felt like their country had been turned into a profitable but humiliated playground for outsiders and a handful of insiders. From that environment came Stage 3, a radicalized middle class. Fidel Castro, trained as a lawyer from a relatively comfortable background, could have aimed for a career within the system. Instead, he organized an armed attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953. The assault failed, and many of his comrades were killed. At his trial, Castro delivered a fiery speech, "History will absolve me," that framed his rebellion as a moral crusade against corruption and foreign domination. He was imprisoned, then amnestied, and went into exile in Mexico, where he regrouped. In 1956, he and a small band of fighters sailed back to Cuba on the yacht Granma. The landing was a disaster. Most of the men were killed or captured. The survivors retreated into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Many movements would have died there. Castro's didn't. Batista's response accelerated Stage 4, the loss of faith in institutions. His forces burned villages suspected of helping the guerrillas, and tortured students and activists in the cities. Every act of repression created new sympathizers for the rebels. Rumors of atrocities traveled faster than government propaganda. The army, meant to protect the population, was increasingly seen as a predatory force. Even the United States, which had long backed Batista, began to distance itself, restricting arms shipments and criticizing human rights abuses. When your own people and your foreign sponsors both begin to turn away, the legitimacy of your rule is over in everything but name. Castro's 26th of July movement grew from a handful of survivors to thousands of fighters, supported by underground cells in the cities and by rural communities who saw them as their champions. That was Stage 5 again, a revolutionary movement promising justice, dignity, and an end to corruption, gaining mass support because the existing order had become intolerable. By late 1958, Batista's army was melting away in the face of guerrilla advances and collapsing morale. Officers fled with stolen money. On New Year's Day 1959, Batista abandoned the island, taking hundreds of millions of dollars with him.
A week later, Castro entered Havana to cheering crowds. The old regime had fallen without a pitched battle. And then, as in France and Russia, Stage 6 revealed its true face. Castro initially spoke the language of democracy and constitutionalism, but within months, opposition newspapers were shut down, political rivals were tried and executed, and Cuba declared itself a socialist state aligned with the Soviet Union. Private businesses were nationalized, land was seized. Many of the middle-class professionals who had applauded the fall of Batista now fled the island in fear for their lives and livelihoods. The revolution that had promised freedom from dictatorship hardened into a new dictatorship, one that would outlast both Batista and Castro's own lifetime. Once again, the pattern completed its arc. France, Russia, Cuba. Three very different societies, three separate centuries, one six-stage cycle that looks eerily familiar when you overlay the timelines. First, wealth piles up at the top until inequality becomes an open insult. Second, a corrupt or incompetent government proves incapable of reform, especially in crisis. Third, the very people who should defend stability, the educated, the professionals, the officers, lose faith and turn against the system. Fourth, institutions that once channeled conflict, parliaments, courts, elections, lose legitimacy, and people begin looking outside the rules for answers. Fifth, organized revolutionary movements step into that vacuum with simple, emotionally powerful promises and gain mass support. Sixth, the old order collapses, and what follows is not the calm, rational utopia the pamphlets described, but bloodshed, purges, and new forms of authoritarian rule. Once you see that skeleton, it's hard not to look around at the United States in 2025 and feel a chill, because the bones of that same creature are showing through the skin. When you bring that pattern home and lay it over the United States, the parallels are uncomfortable enough that most people prefer not to think about them. Yet the numbers and the mood don't care whether we're comfortable. They just accumulate. The first stage has already been reached. Over the last 4 decades, wealth in America has been pulled steadily upward into thinner and thinner air. In 1980, the top 1% controlled roughly 8% of the nation's wealth. Today, their share has quadrupled to more than 30%. Go thinner still to the top 1/10 of 1%, around 130,000 households, and you find more wealth than the entire bottom 90% combined. That's one football stadium of people outweighing almost every other household in the country. You can see the gap, not in statistics, but in skylines and social media feeds. Private jets lining up on tarmacs, while teachers and nurses scroll through rental listings they can't afford. Billionaires launching themselves toward the edge of space, while 20-somethings with master's degrees move back into childhood bedrooms because homeownership is out of reach.
Inequality by itself doesn't guarantee revolution, but it is the first brick in the foundation every single time. The second stage is government corruption and incompetence, or at least the widespread perception of it. Here, too, the signals are blaring. Trust in Congress scrapes the bottom of every poll. Confidence in the Supreme Court, once treated as a kind of secular priesthood, has plunged. People watch lawmakers day trade the same companies they regulate and call it legal. They see corporate lobbyists literally drafting bills, then donating to the campaigns of the politicians who pass them. Infrastructure bills stall, while bridges crumble, and airports feel like time capsules from the 1980s. Meanwhile, the national debt sails past $30 trillion and keeps going, no matter who wins elections, no matter what promises are made about fiscal responsibility. From the outside, it looks less like a republic arguing about how to solve problems and more like a cartel arguing about how to divide spoils. When citizens conclude that government mainly serves donors, not voters, respect for authority rots from the inside. The third stage is the one that quietly flips the switch from discontent to danger, the destruction and radicalization of the middle class. In theory, America is built on that class.
It is supposed to be the broad, stable band of people who work, save, raise families, and have enough stake in the system to want to preserve it. But talk to younger professionals, the lawyers, engineers, nurses, teachers, who did everything right and still feel like the floor is moving under them. They studied, they borrowed, they graduated into an economy where wages have barely moved in real terms, while the cost of housing, healthcare, and education has exploded. Student loans hang around their necks for decades. A single medical emergency can wipe out years of savings. Starting a family feels less like the next chapter in life and more like a financial gamble. Over time, disappointment hardens into anger. The people who believed the promise of the system begin to suspect that the promise was a lie. That anger doesn't stay abstract. It looks for faces and institutions to blame. Some turn their frustration into left-wing demands: higher taxes on the ultra-rich, the breakup of monopolies, wholesale redistribution. Others channel it into right-wing rage at bureaucrats, migrants, or globalists. Underneath the labels, however, is the same feeling. The game is rigged, and those at the top are cheating. When the people who should be the stabilizing force start to talk like that, you're no longer in a normal political cycle. You're in the third movement of the revolutionary symphony. The fourth stage is the collapse of faith in institutions, and this is where the United States currently lives. Look around. Each side of the political divide is convinced the other is not just wrong, but illegitimate. Tens of millions believe the 2020 election was stolen. Tens more believe that a violent protest at the Capitol was an attempted coup. Each camp considers the other a mortal threat to democracy. The FBI is denounced alternately as a weapon of fascism and a nest of traitors. Courts are seen not as neutral arbiters, but as partisan weapons in robes. National media outlets are treated less like sources of information and more like propaganda arms of opposing tribes. Once you cross that line, you no longer have one country arguing with itself. You have two different realities sharing the same geography. In that environment, almost any major shock can become the spark. A disputed election result in a swing state, a deep recession that wipes out savings, a high-profile police killing caught on camera, an assassination attempt that tips into success. History doesn't care about the exact trigger. In France, it was the summoning of a long-dormant assembly. In Russia, it was bread riots colliding with war fatigue.
In Cuba, it was years of brutality that finally broke the aura of fear. What matters is the dryness of the kindling. In the United States, the ground is already crackling underfoot. The weapons are plentiful. The grievances are cataloged and shared at the speed of a swipe. Stage 5, the rise of revolutionary movements with mass support, has not fully arrived yet, but the outlines are visible. At the fringes of both left and right, you can already hear voices saying the quiet part out loud: that elections are a waste of time, that the system is irreparably broken, that only a strong man or a total reset can save the country. Some dream of democratic socialism, others of nationalist revival, some of secession into ideologically pure regions. For now, these currents are fragmented and competing. But France's Jacobins, Russia's Bolsheviks, and Cuba's 26th of July movement also began as small, radical minorities before crisis elevated them. Once economic or political shock pushes enough of the frustrated middle into their arms, moderation is no longer the center of gravity. It becomes a memory. Stage 6, in an American context, is the part almost no one wants to think through in detail, because it forces us to picture the country without its usual guardrails. Still, if history has any value, it's in forcing us to look at the possibilities before they arrive, not after. In that final stage, political violence stops being sporadic and begins to organize. Assassinations are no longer isolated events, but part of campaigns. Militias, gangs, radical groups, whatever name you give them, gain sponsors, structure, and territory.
Some elements of the military and law enforcement stay loyal to the existing government. Others quietly sympathize with revolutionary factions or simply refuse to follow orders they consider illegitimate. Supply chains that seem invisible today suddenly matter a lot when trucking routes are blocked, rail lines are sabotaged, or ports are contested. Grocery shelves thin out, fuel becomes scarce in some regions and wildly expensive in others. Trust, the invisible fuel of any complex society, evaporates fastest of all. In that kind of environment, states might begin to defy federal authority more openly, first in rhetoric, then in law, eventually in practice. Governors could refuse to enforce national rulings. City leaders could declare police or military units unwelcome. At the same time, foreign powers would not sit politely on the sidelines. Just as Germany funneled Lenin back into Russia during World War I, adversaries today would see opportunity in American fragmentation, flooding information channels with disinformation, funding proxies, exploiting cyber vulnerabilities, nudging events in whatever direction weakens the United States the most. The end result might not be a neat red flag revolution or a single coup, but a grinding, multi-sided conflict that leaves the country poorer, angrier, and more authoritarian than anything it rebelled against. That is the nightmare version of Stage 6. The reason to study it is not to wallow in doom, but to understand how many links in the chain have already clicked into place, and how close we may be to the point where the pattern becomes very hard to reverse. If all of this sounds abstract, step back and remember the 3 case studies we walked through: France in 1789, Russia in 1917, Cuba in 1959. 3 very different societies, 3 different ideologies, 3 different centuries, and the same 6-beat rhythm underneath them all. A tiny elite floats above the rest of the population on a cushion of wealth and privilege. The government becomes either hopelessly corrupt, hopelessly incompetent, or both. The middle class that was supposed to be the backbone of stability starts to crumble and turn on the system. Faith in institutions evaporates. Revolutionary movements step into the vacuum with simple, brutal promises.
The old order collapses and is replaced with something more extreme, more violent, more repressive than what came before. The faces and slogans change, but the sequence does not. That's why the comparisons to the United States right now are not just rhetorical flourishes, they're diagnostics. The wealth gap here is already worse than France on the eve of the revolution, measured not in powdered wigs and palaces, but in stock buybacks, luxury real estate, and offshore accounts. The level of distrust in government rivals Russia's late imperial decay, expressed not in whispered kitchen conversations, but in furious comment sections and partisan talk shows. The sense that elections don't matter, that courts are rigged, that media are propagandists, that the system is hardwired against ordinary people. That mood is pure pre-revolutionary Cuba, just transposed onto a continent-sized republic with nuclear weapons and a financial system that anchors the global economy. America's one advantage is that we can see the pattern in real time. The French peasants didn't have access to a centuries-long comparative history of revolutions. Russian factory workers couldn't pull up charts showing how often elites misread the danger signals. Cuban students didn't have podcasts and videos walking them through the math of inequality and institutional collapse. We do. That doesn't guarantee a better outcome, but it removes the excuse of ignorance. If we end up sleepwalking into Stage 5 and Stage 6, it won't be because nobody warned us. It will be because the warnings were more uncomfortable than the illusions we preferred. Is it possible to break the cycle? In theory, yes. Stage 1 and Stage 2 can be addressed by aggressive, real reform. Reducing the extremes of wealth concentration, rebuilding trust through genuine anti-corruption measures, restructuring a system that currently rewards extraction over production.
Stage 3 can be softened if the middle class is given a believable path forward: affordable education, realistic home ownership, a healthcare system that doesn't bankrupt people for getting sick. Stage 4 can be reversed only if institutions start behaving in ways that are transparently fair, even at the cost of short-term political advantage. But here's the hard part. The same people who benefit most from the current arrangement usually have the most power to block those changes. In France, the nobles refused to pay taxes. In Russia, the Tsar refused to share power. In Cuba, Batista refused to step aside or reform his regime. The pattern doesn't just describe what happens to societies, it describes what elites tend to choose when backed into a corner. Maybe the United States will be the exception. Maybe there will be a moment of clarity where enough people in positions of power decide that losing a bit now is better than losing everything later. Maybe voters will punish corruption so consistently that both parties are forced to clean house. Maybe the middle class will be rebuilt before it tips fully into resentment and radicalization. History leaves the door cracked open for that possibility, but only just. 4 revolutions across 6 centuries suggest that once a system drifts deep into stage 4, the odds of a peaceful course correction shrink fast. That's why this isn't just an intellectual exercise, it's a survival question. If you understand that the United States is already in stage 4, you stop treating every election as a superhero movie where one candidate saves the day and the other destroys it. You start looking at deeper indicators. How concentrated is wealth becoming? How are institutions behaving when they're under pressure? Are moderates still able to set the agenda, or are they being pushed aside by people who openly dream of tearing the system down?
You also start asking a more personal question. If stage 5 and stage 6 do arrive in some form during my lifetime, where do I want to be, physically, financially, psychologically, when they hit? For most people, that doesn't mean stocking a bunker or fantasizing about civil war. It means refusing to base your entire life on assumptions that only hold in a calm, stable stage 3 world. It means diversifying where your income comes from and what it depends on. It means building networks of trust that are thicker than online tribes and partisan identities. It means paying attention to the small, boring policy decisions that either diffuse pressure or quietly add more explosives to the pile. Revolutions don't start with a single dramatic moment. They start with years of people tuning out and assuming someone else will handle it. This channel exists because history is yelling at us, and most people have been taught to hear it as a whisper. In the free videos, we'll keep tracing the 6-stage cycle as it actually unfolded in France, Russia, Cuba, and other countries that rode this roller coaster all the way to the bottom. We'll map those trajectories onto current data: inequality metrics, trust surveys, political polarization, institutional behavior, so you can see where the U.S. sits on the curve instead of guessing. For those who want to go deeper, there will be more technical breakdowns: how revolutions have historically affected currencies, debt markets, and real assets. What kinds of businesses and careers tend to survive chaotic transitions? How families in past upheavals quietly positioned themselves years before the headlines caught up. No one can point to a calendar and circle the day the United States crosses from stage 4 into stage 5. History doesn't work on appointment times. What it does provide is a framework, a set of probabilities, and a brutally consistent warning. When a society lets inequality stretch, corruption fester, and faith in institutions decay, while assuming it can't happen here, the pattern answers back. It can, and it has, again and again. The majority almost always wakes up late, after their savings are gone, their illusions shattered, and their choices narrowed to bad and worse. A smaller minority looks at the past with clear eyes, accepts that exceptionalism is a story, not a shield, and adjusts early.
Right now, we stand at the front edge of what is likely to be the defining political and economic story of the next 20 years, whether the American system bends and reforms or snaps and enters a revolutionary cycle. You can't vote that risk away, and you can't tweet it into non-existence. You can only decide whether you want to move through it blind or with a map drawn from centuries of other people's mistakes. If this breakdown has shifted how you see the moment we're living in, if it made you feel, even for a second, that we are not spectators but participants in a very old script, then subscribe. Because when Stage 5 movements start to crystallize, when violence at the edges begins to look less random and more organized, you will want context more than comfort. The answers to what's coming are not hiding in some secret future document. They're written in the pages of France, Russia, Cuba, and dozens of other stories we rarely bother to read. My job is to keep turning those pages with you and showing you where the ink is still wet.